When you picture the Tradwife trend, you think of a mom and a husband and kids and a big, beautiful home with a spacious kitchen and usually some incredible backyard to run around in. And that was my life for 24 years as a Mormon Tradwife. Then one day, my husband fell out of love with me. And for the past 6 years, I've had constant housing instability, moving from a tiny little rental to my car to an apartment, and the only real stable thing in my life has been this storage unit. So, how exactly did I go from living in $1 million homes and driving luxury vehicles and living the Tradwife dream life to sleeping in my vehicle, becoming completely homeless, and dealing with financial devastation that still impacts the life of myself and my children today? Let's dive in. And if you're new here, I'm Jenny Gage, and this is Life Take Two, where I share the collapse of my Mormon Tradwife dream life and the life that I have created for myself now on the other side. I want to say that of all of the things that I talk about, this is the most difficult conversation for me to have. So I'm going to ask you to be gentle in the comments and please suspend your judgment. Yes, now as a 50-year-old woman who is out of the Mormon church and away from this lifestyle, I understand that I made some really stupid, naive mistakes. But as a result of childhood indoctrination, a desire to obey my Mormon church leaders, and the community in which I lived, where all of the women were participating in this behavior, I didn't know any better. It's also extremely embarrassing to share the details that I'm going to share with you about sleeping in my car in the middle of a very wealthy community, spending the night just trying to get that seatbelt thing tamped down in the middle so it wouldn't dig into my ribs, and peeing in a plastic cup because I didn't have access to a bathroom. So please be gentle and suspend your judgment as you watch this video. I want to start by saying that the steps leading up to me becoming homeless were very simple and also very complex. I was married for 24 years to my Mormon returned missionary husband. So there were a lot of little mini decisions that I had made or been forced into along the way. But then there were some really big ones towards the end that led to this abrupt homelessness and struggling for housing. So, first of all, when we divorced, it was very sudden. We hadn't been having like adult conversations around this marriage isn't working. Maybe we should segue out of this. One night, I checked my husband's phone after he had gone to sleep and found a Google search for 19-year-old prostitutes, as well as his conversations in a chat room with a blonde girl in a black bra with some really indecent photos about meeting the next evening at about 5 o'clock. And the next day, having put a tracker in his phone, I followed him up to a QT gas station in Phoenix, Arizona, where a girl and a pimp walked up to his vehicle. The girl appeared to get inside. And that night, our marriage ended as my husband chose to abandon his family for a 19-year-old escort. So I didn't have a lot of preparation time, and we had not been working together as a married couple to, I guess, step out of our relationship and make sure that the finances were all in order. When our marriage ended, my husband immediately became very angry. The next night, I would have a SWAT team that would remove him from my property after he threatened to end my life with a weapon that he had in the closet. So he was immediately in this sociopathic fury that endangered my life. At the time of our collapse of our marriage, we were renting a luxury condo and looking for a home because we had just relocated from Utah back down to Gilbert, Arizona, where we're from. And we were renting, and that right there, I'll talk about just a little bit later, was the nail in the coffin of my finances. Being a stay-at-home mom and being financially dependent on an intimate partner without any assets to divide in a 50-50 state is financial suicide. We had no assets to divide. So our divorce decree is really sad. It simply says after 24 years of marriage, there are no assets that could provide any reasonable living for Miss Gage. So there will be alimony and child support moving forward because I had no money in the bank, because I had no home to divide, because we didn't own anything. My name wasn't on anything. I had nothing. When our marriage ended, I had zero. less than zero because I owed attorney's fees. I had absolutely nothing. And from that time forward, I was financially dependent on a man who hated me and didn't want me alive. And to me, that is the greatest flaw of the American family law system. I don't understand why it made sense to anybody for women to be financially dependent on men who hate them and no longer want to give them anything. Or maybe she's going to get married and have a new guy to take care of her. We need a system where women take care of themselves. For several months, I had no income. 10 months to be exact. And I had friends who did GoFundMe's to help keep me in my home. My Mormon bishop did pay $1,000 one time towards my rent. That was only a third of it. And I was working at a new job for $11 an hour and was able to, I was selling antiques. I sold my diamonds. I was just liquidating everything that I could to keep myself and my children in my home. And then one day, right after our divorce finalized, I went into the front office of my condo just to pick up a package that had come from Amazon with a replacement retainer for my daughter. And while I was at the front office, the women at the desk were kind of giving me funny looks. And one of them pulled me aside and she told me, she said, I can be fired from my job. What I'm about to do is completely illegal. But I have to tell you this, Jenny, because I can't let this happen to you without some warning. It was Thursday. And she said, your husband canceled the lease on your condo, which he was court ordered to let me stay in, and which he was supposed to be paying for, but did not. And you're not even on the lease. You're not even listed as a roommate. So we cannot legally tell you that he canceled this lease weeks ago. It's Thursday. On Saturday, you're going to be forcibly removed from the condo. New people are moving in Saturday afternoon. He hadn't even told me. I had no warning. So me and my kids spent the next few days packing everything up. At that point, I had met Kevin, who is my partner now and also my podcast partner. So you guys see him once in a while. It was a brand new relationship. We'd only been dating for a couple of months. Kevin borrowed a trailer from a friend and he came and helped me pack everything up. And it was a really, really, really fresh relationship. But we discussed renting something together so that I would just have somebody to help pay rent. We weren't at a point in our relationship where I felt like I wanted to be moving in with somebody yet, nor did he. He was renting a room from a friend, but we decided to rent a small home together. I have to say, too, that the couple of days before we moved into that home, after having the shock of my life, and Kevin and I went over to measure the bedroom and see like where my dresser would fit and what furniture I could take with me to this little home and just kind of figure some things out. One evening, we got the keys and went in and we laid on a bed. They'd had the home staged and we laid there staring up at the ceiling, just kind of talking about a future together. Kevin is so kind. He is so loving. He was so supportive through all of these hard times that I was going through. And the two of us still remember this as like one of the most shockingly tragic but also beautiful days of our lives. Just planning a future together with somebody kind and loving was really beautiful. So Kevin and I would combine forces and move into this home together. Again, way too fast for our relationship, but it was the only option that I had for housing. I couldn't put a deposit down on anything. So I talk about a man not being a plan. And in this instance, I had to lean on my new boyfriend to help put the deposit down and move into this house. And it was from this home that we would become homeless. Again, I was financially dependent on alimony and child support. My divorce had finalized the month before move-in when I was evicted from the condo that me and my children were living in. And Jake paid that full alimony and child support one time, just that first month. The second month, he just didn't pay. I was dependent on that alimony to be able to pay my rent. So 1 month after moving into this little home, I didn't have the money. I was working 7 days a week in a brand new sales job with the windshield company that he had fired me from, and my $11 an hour, 4-hour day job at school teaching and selling jewelry and liquidating and doing everything that I could to just make the money that I needed. and I wasn't able to come up with my amount of rent that month, and Kevin didn't have it at all. And then I started to have seizures and migraines, and we discovered that this little home had black mold in it. So, kind of a double whammy after moving into this little house. So, once again, Kevin borrowed a trailer from a friend and we boxed everything up and we moved out of that home because there had been the black mold discovery. The landlords let us out of the month and a half of rent that I was unable to pay. And Kevin helped me just put everything in a storage unit. And that day, me and my children became officially homeless. Kevin moved back into the room that he was renting from a friend, and sometimes I would stay with him, but he also had his children that he had half of the time. So sometimes his kids would be staying with him just in this little master suite with like a bathroom and like a little seating area in a friend's bigger house. And again, Kevin was a really new relationship, so it wasn't his responsibility to care for me. Sometimes I would tent camp. Um, Sometimes I would find friends that I could just sleep on their couches or whatever. But most of the time, I was too embarrassed to admit to people that I had nowhere to live. And I found it was just more simple to sleep in my car where all of my stuff was, in a Walmart parking lot, occasionally just in a park and things like that. And I spent part of the time living with my aunt and uncle 2 hours away. And here's what my kids did. My little son was 8 years old at the time of my divorce. I filled up a Rubbermaid box with all of the clothes in his backpack and socks and toothbrush and all of his notebooks and things for school that he would need. And I had a very carefully orchestrated schedule for my two children who were still at home, um, to spend like 3 nights at this friend's house and then 2 nights at a cousin's house and then 2 nights at somebody from Bible study that they barely knew. And my kids just rotated people's homes for much of that time. Sometimes we would all go up for the weekend in tent camp. And occasionally, when I had the money, I would rent motels so that me and my kids could spend a weekend together. I had full custody of the kids. They were not living with my ex husband, and the courts had given me full custody for many reasons. So, just a few months into the end of my marriage, I had gone from my luxury condo to the little house and then living in my vehicle. Finally, one Christmas, I was able to get approved for a credit card. So I maxed out that Costco credit card and rented a VRBO from a friend so that I could live with my kids for 4 weeks. And then he threw in an extra week for only like $300 because there was nobody else who had rented the house. So that was my third home after my divorce, was living in a vacation rental that was infested with scorpions, by the way. There was a reason why nobody was in that vacation rental at Christmas time. And we lived there. Um, I couldn't afford a second month. So as our time in that space ended, I went down to Tucson to visit my uncle at Christmas time. My uncle, who's my mom's youngest brother, he's a famous architect, and he had a little guest house casita in his backyard, which if you've seen my first video on how I became homeless, I take a bunch of videos of that little guest house that we just moved out of. It had been vandalized to the tune of $160,000. The windows were smashed out, walls were damaged, carpet was ripped up. It was surrounded by glass. There were snakes and rodents inside the home. And while I was at his house for Christmas, he walked me out to this little guest house. And it's a beautiful home, but small and destroyed and horrible. And he said, I know you have nowhere else to go. And I know that I'm 2 hours away from your kids and your life and everything, but also 2 hours away from Jake, which could be a real benefit to you. So if you would like to move into the guest house, you can do a potential rent to own. I can file the insurance claim to have it all fixed up for you. And then we can work out an agreement where you can have a reduced rent for labor and improvements. And I had absolutely nowhere else to go. So I decided right then that I would have to move into that guest house. And I actually moved down to Tucson at that point. Sometimes would sleep at my aunt and uncle's house, but spent most of the next month sleeping on a concrete slab out in the desert, outside of the guest house in the backyard of what would become our home. Finally, during the beginning of the pandemic, so March of 2020, the insurance company had paid for all of the repairs on the home. So it had windows and doors and new carpet and fresh paint. And most of the stuff had been at least cleaned up and made functional. And so me and my children moved into my uncle's guest house in his backyard. So luxury condo, little teeny house with black mold that I couldn't afford, then my car for 3 months, then a VRBO for 5 weeks, and then our guest house. Moving into that guest house was really hard for my kids who had just gone through a divorce because they were happy in their schools up in Gilbert and we were moving 2 hours away. And then the pandemic hit. So in my book, that's actually like the darkest time of our lives. I was also very sick from the anoxic brain injury and then the black mold exposure on top of that. And I would continue to have seizures and a cascading series of neurological problems. Over the next several months, I would be completely homebound, and that's where I was when I did my very first TikTok video, utterly homebound, in between seizures, in the middle of a pandemic where me and my kids were completely isolated, living alone in this tiny little guest house. And the kids put TikTok on my phone because they thought it would keep me entertained. And I did my very first TikTok video about escaping Mormon Tradwife life. Um, so sometime during that spring, Kevin and I continued dating from a distance. He would come down on the weekends, sometimes bring his kid. And we realized that we wanted to be in each other's lives long term. And our kids got along great and everything. And even though he had a job 2 hours away, he left everything so that he could come down to Tucson and be with me. So he became a dean of students at a private Christian school here. And that summer, we had a commitment ceremony and he moved in with me and we began working on that little guest house together. I remember on one of our first dates, because he was a woodworker, he had told me I'd love to be your chip gain someday. And that's kind of how we discussed him moving down to Tucson with me. I said, hey, you promised me chip gain. So if you're into it, then come down, help me fix up this little house and we can make a home for ourselves. This little home had only ever been an office and then a guest house. It was in disrepair, even though the insurance claim had been filed and the main repairs and fix-ups had been done. There was a lot of work, and we bought supplies at Home Depot on clearance whenever we had a little bit of extra money. And we spent the next 3.5 years. Is that how long we were in that house? Fixing up and making it absolutely beautiful. And we thought that we were going to purchase it and that that would be my final home for life. It was while living in that guest home too, that one day when I only had $60 left in my bank account and $200 worth of bills to pay, I was sitting in the parking lot of a thrift store, Deseret Industries to be specific, and just crying my eyes out like I'm never, ever going to have the money to do anything. And couldn't buy groceries, couldn't pay bills. Like it was such a terrible financial circumstance. I had just gotten out of the hospital with my fourth surgery following COVID. I had a 10-inch deep vein thrombosis. My left leg was still paralyzed. I had been in a wheelchair for 3 months. My health problems were the biggest cause of me not being able to provide for myself after my divorce. And I had just gotten rid of the wheelchair, had just gotten rid of the walker, was walking a little bit on my own. And that day I was like, hey, I bet that I can stand up, use a sander, and do something to like repair furniture. So I took the last $60 that I owned, walked into Deseret Industries, bought 2 twin beds and an upholstered bed, took them home, cleaned up, painted, flipped them. By the end of the day, I had my bills paid and a little bit of money to pay for groceries and some extra money to reinvest. So I started a furniture flipping business from that guest house in my uncle's backyard in the middle of the pandemic, just a few weeks after getting out of a wheelchair, after months and months of having been hospitalized in multiple surgeries. And that furniture flipping business during the pandemic was, first of all, what would give me a lot of skills to help me run my social medias and stuff that I do today. But it would also help me pay my rent and buy groceries and provide for my children on my own for the first time in my entire life. Then in May of this year, I was up at my uncle's house getting mail one day when my aunt handed me a letter telling us that they were selling the whole property, including our home that we had hoped to be able to purchase, and that we had 30 days to vacate. So in May of this year, we had to leave that little home, which was my first YouTube video that I posted here after coming over from TikTok. And it was so heartbreaking for my children. They are still heartbroken. We went to get mail up there because we still have some straggling pieces of mail that are still going up to that house. And my son was with me, my 15-year-old, and he was physically shaking. And he said, "It makes me so sick to see this house because I thought this was going to be my house for life, but it's not." So in May of this year, we moved into our tiny little apartment, and this is the first home since my divorce that I can't be kicked out of unless I don't have the money to pay for rent, which is always a threat. That I have a lease that I rented myself, that my name is on, and that I picked exclusively on my own. And even though it was really devastating to leave the little house that we had spent so much time and heart and passion fixing up. We're very happy where we are. I love the location. We have some amazing neighbors. And in a way, it's nice to have such a tiny little apartment because I don't have a lot of housework or anything to do. So it leaves me a lot of free time to do interviews, work on my book, and work as a domestic violence advocate and all the other things that I do. Of course, in my Man Proof Your Life program with my private clients, I teach all kinds of different choices that I could have done differently to safeguard my financial future. In this video, I just want to focus on one, and that is having your name on assets and making sure that there are assets with enough value to support you should a relationship end. The fact that my whole entire future, my life, my kids' abilities to eat, my ability to provide housing for myself was completely dependent on a romantic relationship. My husband being in love with me was what fed and housed myself and my kids, should be illegal. And it was a really dangerous risk. The minute we went from home ownership to renting, I should have made sure that I had my own job, my own source of income. I should have demanded the spousal trust that I teach to my clients. And at that moment, done a post-nup in the middle of our marriage to protect some assets for myself. The night that my husband abandoned our family, he withdrew all of the hundreds of thousands of dollars from our bank. Those were never found. They were never recovered. And I never saw any of those. If you are in a romantic relationship, whether married or just committed, and you are renting, you don't have property ownership, you don't own the home, you don't have assets to divide, then you are making a grave mistake at great risk to yourself. If we owned a home in Arizona, 50-50 state, we would have had to have split the equity, and I would have been able to live somewhere. I wouldn't have been homeless sleeping in my car. If I hadn't had family members that were able to help me, my uncle, if I hadn't had some friends that were shooting me like hundreds of dollars at a time, and then TikTok followers that were helping me pay for rent, I would have never been able to have a home to live in. My TikTok followers just 3 months ago paid my rent after my fourth surgery this year because I still am not financially able to provide for myself. I hear a lot of videos online right now about the gray divorce. I was 45 when my divorce finalized. I'm almost 51. And that right there is the most vulnerable time to get divorced if you haven't made sure that you have assets to divide and that you're able to provide for yourself. I had 4 children, like I said earlier, completely financially dependent on me. I had a son in college that we were providing all of his food, paying for his vehicle. I had a daughter who was living out of state because I had come back to Arizona. She was finishing up her senior year in Utah. I was sending her grocery money. I was paying for her vehicle. I was paying for all of her expenses as she lived out of state. And then I had 2 younger children. My husband would repossess the vehicles of the 2 children out of state. My oldest son would have to drop out of college that year because we had had so much income. None of us qualified for any grants or anything, but I couldn't pay for him. That high school daughter was starving to death. She has all kinds of social media videos where she's down to like 92 pounds, can't buy groceries, and couldn't buy clothing. And again, he repossessed her vehicle, so she had no transportation and wasn't able to get to college or to high school. And then my two youngest children, we were eating out of some Catholic food pantries in the Gilbert area. And I was finally able to qualify for food stamps once the divorce was filed. But we starved and were homeless throughout that divorce. Those gray divorces with children are so high risk. And it was just a simple matter of I hadn't prepared. Why did any of this happen? Because I believed that love could be forever. I believed in happily ever after. When we went into the Mormon temple and made covenants for time and all of eternity, I thought that that was real. I thought that Heavenly Father would bless our marriage and that we would thrive and flourish and be happy and live together forever. There was never once a thought in my mind as a 20-year-old girl that someday my marriage might end, that he might fall out of love with me, that we might get divorced. I spent my whole entire life as though the best case scenario was going to happen and didn't once ever, ever, ever think about planning for a worst case scenario. And that to me is the biggest eye opener now that I am a 50-year-old grandma on the other side of divorce and no longer living that tradwife life. There's nothing else in life that we just operate on the best case scenario. When I get in my car, I'm not like, oh, I'll never be in a car accident. So I'm not going to wear the seatbelt. And I don't care if I have airbags and screw insurance. I don't need insurance. No, every time I get in my vehicle, I act as though there may be some type of car accident. So I have all of those things in place. I don't treat my health like everything's going to be the best case scenario, like, oh, I'm just going to live forever. No, I make sure that I know my family cancer risk and heart disease, and I have my cholesterol checked, and I eat healthy so that I can make sure that I'm preserving my health throughout my life as much as I can. I wouldn't go into business with somebody just because they gave me a kiss on the cheek and a diamond ring and told me that they were going to be the best partner possible. No, I go into business with my business partner, Beth, with a business strategy and an exit strategy with all kinds of legal documents signed and lots of conversations around what could happen on the other side. And it's just absolutely wild that we don't do the same with our romantic relationships. As a 19-year-old girl, when I fell in love with my husband of 24 years and then 20 years old when I got married, we should have had the conversations around what if you die? What if we divorce? What plans can we put in place to make sure that I am protected, to make sure that our children are not homeless and starving? Nobody should go into any romantic relationship without safeguards in place, planning for the worst case, and then maybe we're surprised if it is happily ever after. With a 50% divorce rate, with a 70% chance of major catastrophe while you are married and raising kids, and that 70% is divorce, death, disability, job loss of the primary caretaker, and then other things like natural disasters, earthquakes, wars, recessions, etc. With a 70% divorce rate of major catastrophe, there is no reason why one little blonde girl like myself should be skipping through the daisies like, la la la, everything's going to be fine. Let me wrap this up with this. A man is not a plan. He can be your lover, your boyfriend, your husband, your whatever you want him to be, but he is not your ticket to a stable financial future. I now work 7 days a week just to make sure that I am never reaching for a red Solo cup on the floor of a Mercedes that I cannot afford to put gas in so that I can pee at 2 a.m. That is my basic mission in life. Now I'd love to hear from you. What are you doing to prepare yourself in case your marriage fails? And if you've been divorced, how did it go for you financially?